The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Cachetis, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week we're going to take a look back at the histories of Philadelphia's two Major League Baseball franchises, the A's and the Phillies. On first glance, it's pretty clear that the A's, who won 5 World Championships and 9 American League pennants, were more successful than the Phillies, who've only claimed 2 World Series titles and 7 National League pennants. But were the A's an elite franchise during their time in Philadelphia, or always an elite franchise? Were the Phillies always as bad as their 10,853 losses and counting suggest? By the way, I believe the Phillies still are the losingest team in Major League Baseball history, right? To answer those questions and give us a better understanding of the history of both franchises is David Jordan, a former attorney and the author of 7 books, including The A's, A Baseball History, and Occasional Glory, The History of the Philadelphia Phillies, both of which were published by McFarland Books. Welcome to the podcast, David.
Good to be aboard, Bill.
Let's begin with you. Your first book was a biography of Roscoe Conkling, a 19th century senator from New York and the only person confirmed to a seat on the Supreme Court who then refused the post. That biography, published in 1971, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. You've also written 2 well-received biographies on Civil War generals Winfield Scott Hancock and Gouverneur K. Warren. Why on earth did you decide to write about baseball, David?
Because I have been a baseball fan for most of my life, since I was 8 years old. Mm-hmm. And I've always been interested, particularly in the Philadelphia teams.
Mm-hmm. So when and how did your interest in the A's and the Phillies begin? Did you favor one team more than the other?
Well, when I was about 8 years old, my father had his real estate office at Broad and Erie in Philadelphia, and his great uncle, who had brought him up down in Smyrna, Delaware, was living at that point in about 3 or 4 blocks away from where my father's office was. So he took me over there several times, and Uncle George Barnes was a great baseball fan. And I remember sitting around in his living room with him while listening to broadcasts of the afternoon games of the A's and the Phillies. And Byram Salm was doing his best. And eventually, Uncle George was a Phillies fan. He didn't like Connie Mack. But however, my father, toward the end of May, I guess it was Memorial Day, took me and Uncle George down to Shibe Park to see the A's and the Detroit Tigers play a doubleheader. And I was very happy to be there. In the first game, Hal Newhouser of the Tigers pitched a 2-hit shutout against the A's. And I became a great fan of Hal Newhouser's, and I did write a biography of him, which he believed got him into the Hall of Fame. But in the second game of that doubleheader, the A's won behind a knuckleball pitcher named Roger Wolf. So I became a great A's fan at that point. And sometime, several weeks later, Uncle George made sure we went back again to see the Phillies play. But and they played the Cardinals, and he had told me his great idol on the Phillies was an outfielder named Danny Litweiler. And when we were going down to the ballpark, he said we were going to get to see Danny Litweiler play. But unfortunately, the Phillies had, a couple days earlier, traded Danny to the Cardinals. Oh. So we saw Danny Litweiler playing in a visiting uniform. Wow. But that was the first times I got to the ballpark, and I've tried to get to the ballpark as often as I could over the years since then. But the interesting thing, of course, was that I was an A's fan and not a Phillies fan. because at the time you tended to root for one or the other, but not for both. And so I rooted for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the National League until the A's left town, and then the Phillies were all that was left, so I became a fervent Phillies fan after that.
I'm glad you mentioned the Newhouser biography, because that was my introduction to your writing, and I was very impressed with it. And you were kind enough, after I contacted you, to review my very first book, which was on the one-armed wonder Pete Gray of the 1945 St. Louis Browns. And I am very grateful that you, in many respects, gave me my start in baseball writing. So I will always be grateful to you for that.
But I did get to see Pete Gray play a few times, too, in 1945.
Right. You would mention that. The Phillies are the older of the two franchises. They date to 1883, but as we both know, the A's were much more successful. In addition to the 9 pennants and the 5 world championship titles, Mac had built 2 championship dynasties, the dead ball era 1910 to 1914 and the lively ball era 1929 to 1931. Why was that the case? How was Mac able to do that when he came into Philadelphia and lacked such talent that he raided the roster of the Phillies?
Well, this was at a time when the two leagues were the American League was just getting started as a major league, and the National League didn't really believe it was a major league and didn't recognize it in 1901. Mm-hmm. But Connie Mack came into Philadelphia. He had been managing in Milwaukee, and Ben Johnson, the president of this new American League, convinced him to come into Philadelphia because he needed a strong man in Philadelphia because they were going to take on the Phillies as the team that was already established there. And Connie Mack made friends with a couple of Philadelphia baseball writers for the local newspapers, and they happened to know which players on the Phillies were very unhappy with John Rogers, the Phillies owner, who was involved in keeping their salaries down and trying to keep them pretty much subdued. And so Connie Mack, with the help of these baseball writers, managed to get a hold of a couple of the big stars, Napoleon Lajoie for one, Elmer Flick for another, and several pitchers, and he was able to sign them up, and they became players for the A's in the first A's season, and very successful players too. Mm-hmm. And at the start of the second year, 1902, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania finally responded to a lawsuit which Rogers, the Phillies owner, had brought against Mack and Benjamin Scheib, who was the money man behind Connie Mack. And the Supreme Court held that Lajoie's contract with the Athletics was not valid because he was already signed to the Phillies, and therefore he could not play with them anymore. Mm-hmm. And so Rogers got an injunction from the court in Philadelphia against the A's, against Lajoie playing for the A's. Mm-hmm. On opening day, the A's were playing down in Baltimore, and in the 9th inning of the game, Connie Mack was given notice of this injunction that had been granted to the Phillies against him playing Lajoie, so he took Lajoie off the field at that point. And, of course, Lajoie then had to go back and sit down and talk with Rogers, the Phillies owner. And Rogers, in one of the dumbest things ever, said, all right, the first thing we're going to do is levy a heavy fine upon you for jumping the team last year. And as anybody with any common sense could have figured, Lajoie got up and walked out at that point.
Now, was it that kind of attitude on Rogers' part that resulted in the abysmal records of the Phillies in those early years? Because they really weren't a very competitive team until the 1910s, and particularly 1915 when they won their first pennant.
Yeah, the Rogers was a pretty dismal owner. The Phillies had a number of them who were not all that great. They the owner before Rogers had been ousted from the league because his name was Horace Fogel, and he had complained. He had alleged that the whole National League pennant race was fixed, and so the National League ousted him from baseball, and that's when Rogers got involved, along with Al Reach, who was one of the early great baseball stars, and he had become involved in sporting goods production in Philadelphia. But he didn't get along all that well with Rogers either. And Reach, is one of his partners in the sporting goods business was Benjamin Scheib. And when Scheib told him that he had been offered the chance to become part owner of this new team, the Athletics, that were coming to town, Reach told him to go ahead and do it. He thought it was a wise move for him to do, despite his partnership with Rogers on the Phillies ownership.
Well, I think the where they both benefited was that weren't they also the distributors of Spalding baseballs, which had the contract for Major League Baseball?
Yes, yeah, and the A's were able to do that, and Van Johnson agreed that the contract for the baseball could go to Reach, and he made the baseballs for the American League.
Now, it's interesting because Mac's fortunes, as you already mentioned, really kind of skyrocketed starting in 1902. And Mac was, I believe, the only manager to build championship dynasties in both the dead ball and lively ball eras. David, what was the secret to his success?
Well, I think he was a very good judge of ball players' abilities. He had some good friends who looked out for him and found some people around, some guys that turned out to be good ball players. But he just seemed to do things right as a manager, and he was blessed with an owner who had the pocketbook behind him, who pretty much went along with what Mac had to do, although he never went out of his way to spend a lot of money because he didn't have all that much. But he knew how to maneuver players, how to judge them, and how to get them to do their best. And it worked out very well over several different periods.
He was also a shrewd businessman who anticipated some of the economic trends in the modern game by the manner in which he built and dismantled his championship teams. Can you describe some of those tactics for us?
Well, of course, he was one of the ones who was one of the first ones to put lights on for his baseball field. And that certainly anticipated what everybody else was going to do eventually. And, he knew how to run the club and the clubhouse and so that things worked out well. He dismantled his first dynasty because he knew his players had been getting good offers from the Federal League, which was in a third major league at the time, was trying to become established. So after the 1914 World Series, when his team got blown away in the series by the Boston Braves, he put his 3 top pitchers up for waivers at the end of the season. Mm-hmm. And because he knew that they were being looked at and offered good money by the Federal League. And, 2 of them did sign with the Federal League, and one of them was picked up by Brooklyn in the other league. Mm-hmm. And of course, at the same time, Frank Baker, his third baseman, Frank Home Run Baker, was under contract for 1915, but he wanted to have his contract altered and get more money. And Mr. Mack said, no, you've got the contract, you have to play. And so Baker said, well, his alternatives were to play or not to play, so he stayed home all year. And that helped to tear down the ball club, the dynasty, as well. And at the end of that season, of course, Mack sold Baker to the Yankees.
Mm-hmm. Now, one gets the impression that in addition to be a tall tactician, wonderful strategist, and a shrewd businessman, that Mack was also something of a mentor to his players. He had this ability to mold a team of collegians like Eddie Plank.
Well, Eddie Collins was...
And Eddie Collins with Columbia. Some dim-witted roustabouts like Rube Waddell and shoeless Joe Jackson, although Jackson didn't hang around long enough for the first championship dynasty, but he molded these guys into a fairly successful team.
You mentioned Rube Waddell, and, they always, use adjectives about unusual, and I think Rube Waddell was mentally retarded. Mm-hmm. But Mack managed to keep him busy. He managed to keep him interested in doing the best thing he could on the field, and he got a number of very fine seasons out of Rube Waddell as a pitcher for him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Baseball, when Mack first came into the game, was not a very well-respected sport. I mean, the players were considered gypsies and lowlifes. It also had somewhat of a circus atmosphere. I mean, you refer to Waddell, who's known for chasing after fire trucks and loose women and going to the Burley-Q. And Mack also had mascots or bat boys who were humpback dwarfs. So was he actually seizing on all fronts here? Not only was he a winning manager, but he had these players in the circus atmosphere to attract fans, or was that just baseball at that time? Because he did, or at least he's credited with straightening up the game and giving it some respectability.
Yeah, I think the fact that Connie Mack was a dignified businessman as well as a manager, who didn't wear a uniform, but he sat in the dugout in his coat and tie and looked like a businessman in the dugout. I think that helped to establish the game in the public, and and his not only his appearance, but what he did and his tactics and his public image were also good for the image of the game.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know a couple books have been written about the 1929 team. One of them was mine, and at least what I found in writing that book was that if we look at dynasties, 29 through 31 with the A's, because as we know, the ability to repeat is really a sign of greatness. That dynasty knocked the mighty New York Yankees, out of first place.
They always talk about the 27 Yankees as one of the great teams of all time. I've always said the 9 A's were the greatest team of all time. because they finished 18 games ahead of the New York Yankees, who were still pretty much the same team that they had been in 1927.
That's right. And at least the statistics that I saw when I was writing my book was that the 1929 through 31 A's had better pitching, they had a better defense, they had a better bench, and the offense, the team offense, was maybe, 8 percentage points less than the offense of the New York Yankees from 26 to 28, because they had the power tandem of Fox and Simmons. So my argument is that team, as you said, was a better team than the 27 New York Yankees, which leads me to my next question. That today we look back and it's difficult to imagine that Philadelphia had a team that was more successful than the New York Yankees, definitely in the dead ball era, and arguably more successful during the lively ball era. Is it a stretch to say that Philadelphia might have been home to a perennial World Series contender had Mac's sons been better able to continue his success?
Well, it's tough to say much about Mac's sons. Earl Mac was an assistant coach for decades, and he was always supposed to be next in line to be manager. But he wasn't much of a baseball man. The players never had much respect for him. Mm-hmm. And Roy Mac was questionable as to how much competence he had, particularly when you look at what happened in 1954 and how he managed to play or run the team out of town. Mm-hmm. But Connie Mack stayed on and on and on, and after a while it became clear, I guess late in the 30s and into the 40s, that he was becoming senile.
Right. He had surrogates running the team for him at various times. I guess Jimmy Dykes ran the team. I think Cochran maybe for a while. The last surrogate manager he had was Eddie Joost, I believe.
Yeah, Eddie Joost was the last manager. Well, in 1950, Dykes took over as manager officially. Mm-hmm. Connie Mack stepped down, and Dykes managed him in 50 and 51, in 52 and 53, I guess, and then Joost managed them in 54. But at that point, Connie Mack was, quote, president, unquote, but he was not running the team at all because he was mentally unsound at that time. Mm-hmm. And to have Earl and Roy running it, it's no wonder they wound up in Kansas City.
Yeah, Mac would have been better to sell or find someone much better to run the business aspects or the organization than his own sons. Although he did anticipate, I think, another trend in the modern game, which was to bring on established veteran players to mentor a younger generation. I mean, we kind of see this right now with the Philadelphia Phillies in bringing Arrieta and Santana onto the team. But in 1927, Connie Mack had Ty Cobb. He brought Ty Cobb over from Detroit. Eddie Collins he brought back from Chicago. Zach Wheat. Those three guys are Hall of Famers, and they mentored a host of Hall of Famers in Lefty Grove, Mickey Cochran, Al Simmons, Jimmy Fox.
They were in their prime.
Those players.
Grove and Cochran and Simmons.
Grove and Cochran, right. But am I wrong in saying that at least there was at least some mentoring going on, between those guys? Because didn't if I look at the the game, the box scores of those games, it seemed that when Mac really needed wins in 27 in September of 27, when he was vying for the pennant, the guys who were seeing more regular playing time were Collins, and Cobb, was a regular in the outfield, but
he was still hitting 300.
That's right. I heard an interesting story too, that a young guy by the name of, at that time, Joe Hauser, who was vying for the batting title, I believe it was in 27, maybe it was in 28, was vying for the batting title, and Ty Cobb gave him some tips and purposely ruined his hitting so he could take the batting title, or at least beat him out of it. So I'm not sure how great a teammate Ty Cobb was for the A's.
Look, Connie Mack was never a great fan of Ty Cobb's, but I guess at that period in his career, he knew that Cobb was still able to get some good ball playing done, and he could get a hold of him at that point because he'd been fired as manager. Cobb had been.
And was suspected of throwing a game.
Pardon?
With the Tigers, too. So I think there was an element of redemption there for Cobb. We've talked a little bit about the decline of the A's in the 1950s, and it seemed that the fortune of the Phillies were on the rise as those of the A's were declining. And a lot of that had to do with new owner Bob Carpenter. How was Carpenter able to turn the fortunes of the Phillies around, David?
Well, he had a lot of money,
and
that made a big difference because the A's at that time, and the A's never really had a lot of money. Unlike some of the other teams, where the owners had $1 million bank accounts to fall back on if they went into the red little. The A's always had to try to worry about, making enough just to keep going. And when the Phillies, over those years, the Phillies, through the Baker years and then Jerry Nugent's years, always had problems with money. And suddenly, when Bob Carpenter got the team with all that DuPont money that he had, it made a big difference in how you operated the ball club.
He was, in many respects, among the last of the leisurely gentleman owners before baseball became a big business. There were stories about Bob Carpenter, I guess it would have been junior because Rulli was the third, going out and shagging flies in the outfield and taking batting practice with the players and getting to know them and their families. Obviously you just don't see that in baseball anymore.
Yeah. Well, with Carpenter, they were able to do a lot better scouting, to sign young players who had really good futures ahead of them, and it made a huge difference in the rise of the Phillies. While the A's were still stuck with no money to play around with and players who were getting old and tired.
Now, the Phillies had that wonderful team called the Whiz Kids that was coming on in 1948-49, and then they won the pennant in 1950 with players like Jim Constanti, Richie Ashburn, Robin Roberts, Kurt Simmons, Del Ennis, Andy Semenuk was the catcher. Whatever happened to those guys, though? I mean, they were so young. I think the average age of that team in 1950 when they took the pennant was like 23 years old, but they were never heard from again. What happened?
Well, in 51, they kind of collapsed. But, they had decent careers. Ashburn had a long career and wound up in the Hall of Fame, as did Robin Roberts. And Del Ennis drove in a lot of runs over the years. They were just never able to put it all together again. Mm-hmm. And, Kurt Simmons had a great start, but he kind of faded a little. And Constanti, of course, was a veteran who had the one great relief year in 1950, and then he kind of moved along after that.
That story of not being able to put it together again seems to have become a pattern. 1964, of course, the young Phillies team, are up by 6.5 games with 12 left to play. They lose 10 in a row and finish tied for second place. I guess it was with the Reds. Cardinals beat them out. And those guys were really never heard from again either. What's your take on that one?
Well, I suffered through that. By then, of course, I was a dyed-in-the-wool Phillies fan, and I remember we went to, I believe, 3 of those 10 games that they lost at the end, sitting down there in Shibe Park. And I don't know. I always thought Gene Mauch was a fine manager, but everything kind of fell apart there at the end of '64. Mm-hmm. And they had Johnny Callis and continued to have a good career after that, but some of the others just faded away.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people attribute that swoon to the fact that Mauch was too anxious to get it all over with and was pitching bunting and short his 2 top pitchers on less than 3 days rest, which you just can't do. And that's how history has labeled those. David, you've seen a lot of baseball. You started in the 1940s, and I'd imagine you've seen a lot of wonderful games. You already talked about the game where you saw Hal Newhouser pitch against the A's. I know that you saw Sandy Koufax's no-hitter in Philadelphia. Was that in '64?
I don't remember exactly
64,
when
65,
that was.
One of the two. But what, and obviously, we've both seen the Phillies from the 1960s on. We saw the 2 World Series in 1980 and 2008. Of all the Phillies games you've seen, for you personally, what has been the most memorable and why?
I was thinking about that, and I decided the most memorable Phillies game that I ever saw was I think it was 5 of the 1993 World Series.
Oh, yeah.
The night before, my daughter and I sat down there and watched them blow a lead and lose 15-14 to the Toronto Blue Jays.
That's right.
And the next night, I had tickets again, and we went down, and that was the night that Curt Schilling pitched his 2-hit shutout and kept the Phillies alive. And that was really a very memorable game for me. And,
great game.
It got him to go off to Toronto where Mitch Williams could blow it the next night.
Yeah. And I still to this day, I remember watching Joe Carter hit that home run, and I couldn't believe it. I really thought, as I think many people in Philadelphia, even after that Game 4 debacle, I really thought that the 93 Phillies were a team of destiny. There was no way they were going to lose that series, just no way. So that was devastating. I mean, that was devastating. I remember after Carter hit that home run, we were living in East Falls at that period of time. I just walked our block 8-9 times. I couldn't believe it.
It was tough. But, talking about memorable games, I was thinking about the A's, and my most memorable ballpark visit with the A's was when I was down there on Memorial Day in 1947. And they had a doubleheader with the New York Yankees, with Joe DiMaggio and Tommy Henrich and George McQuinn and Yogi Berra and Phil Rizzuto and all those guys on the Yankees.
Great team.
And the A's won both games by shutouts. Dick Fowler shut them out 5-0 in the first game, and Joe Coleman won his first Major League victory, shutting out the Yankees 2-0 in the second game.
You're kidding me. Wow.
And that was just my greatest day as an A's fan.
Oh, wow.
By that time, I had already become a bitter anti-Yankees hater anyway.
Who was responsible for the A's offense in those games? Do you remember?
Oh, it was Eddie Joost and let's see. I don't think Fane was up with them at that point, but Sam Chapman and Eddie Joost and Pete.
Was Gus Zernial there yet?
Pardon me?
Was Gus Zernial there yet?
No, he was not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
But they got him in the 50s.
Right, okay. Well, I have to ask you this question before we end because it's one of these kind of indulgent questions, woulda, shoulda, coulda. But knowing the fates of the two organizations as you do, and I doubt there's many that know them better because you've written histories on both of the organizations. David, if you had the choice, would you go back in time and follow the A's from their beginnings in 1901? Would you relive your life as a Philadelphia baseball fan exactly as you did? Or would you stay put right here in 2018 following the current Phillies in the hope that they will build their own championship dynasty?
That's a tough question, but I am now as rabid a Phillies fan as I was an A's fan back in those days. So I guess I'd stick with the current team and hope that they're going to come back again. Suddenly they came up with Jimmy Rollins and Chase Utley and Ryan Howard and all those fellows and had a great stretch a few years back. And I keep thinking maybe they'll do it again. I look at Rhys Hoskins and hope maybe he'll strike out a bit less. And it's great having the baseball team in town.
It is. It is. I have to admit, though, I'm greedier than you are. In 1994, when baseball went on strike, there was no World Series, as you know. I was so disheartened that what I did that next year was I went to the Philadelphia Free Library and I Xeroxed off from microfilm all the front sports pages of the Philadelphia Public Ledger of the 1929 season. And I followed each day of the 1929 season from its beginning in April through October and the World Series. And I was teaching at Penn Charter that time, and many of the baseball players who I taught actually got very interested in the A's because of it, because I'd come into class and I'd say, wow, these guys, Fox, Cochran, boy, they've got a really good future. I think they're going to do something this year. And we made a game out of it. But I think, the students learned something about baseball and the teams that were in this town. And I have to tell you, I think I was born probably 70 years too late. If I had to do over again, I would have wanted to be around for the first part of the 20th century and seen those two championship dynasties that Connie Mack built. I would have loved that.
Speaking about Penn Charter, Jack Meyer was the Penn Charter pitcher, came out and wound up with the Phillies for a couple of seasons. And when I was playing ball at Penn Charter, not very successfully, I did manage to hit a couple of very long foul balls off Jack Meyer.
And did you remind him of that?
No.
Several times.
Never did.
Yeah, I forgot. You're a Penn Charter grad. There are a couple of Penn Charter grads, baseball writers that came out. Rich Westcott, I believe, is a Penn Charter grad. And, of course, an illustrious baseball tradition as well with Mark Gubisaw and Ruben Amaro, actually Amaro brothers coming out of there. Wonderful school. I enjoyed my time there immensely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you. Thanks for being with us. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for your works. I look forward to more of them. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatis, rounding third,
Bill,
heading home